Okay, so week 3, we're going to talk about preference assessments. And starting from the beginning, preference assessments are really important foundations for behavior support plans. And you need to make sure that you do preference assessments so you can identify potential reinforcers before implementing behavior change plan. So you need to make sure that you've identified potential reinforcements because reinforcers are how we shape behavior, right? It's how we increase behavior or maintain behavior we want to see. Preference assessments identify stimuli that are likely to function as reinforcers, as well as their relative preference value. One thing that in my private practice I sometimes get a little nitpicky about is if my RBTs say, oh, that's his reinforcer, oh, that reinforces him. I say, well, we don't know that because we haven't done a reinforcer assessment, but we can say that it may function as a potential reinforcer, or it's a stimulus that may have reinforcing qualities or something like that. So I have seen a lot of mock questions that will slip in their reinforcer or will slip in their potential reinforcer. Be careful because that's how it's signaling to you whether they're talking about a preference assessment or an actual reinforcer assessment. If any of you guys came across any, I'm pretty sure there was one in the BDS module. Always those tiny fine discriminations. So when it comes to preference assessments, be aware of MOs in effect. So I'd like to hear from you guys. Does anybody want to tell me what I mean by this, be aware of MOs in effect? Do you have any personal experience of running a preference assessment when you did not take MOs into consideration? Yeah, perfect. Hunger after lunch. If you have satiation and you try to do some sort of edible preference assessment, that's it, not going to count. I remember one time trying to do a preference assessment after Christmas, and this child had received, like, I don't know, 100 toys from Santa Claus. So all of the toys that we had in the clinic at the time, they had very little reinforcing value, or that they were low, very unlikely to be potential reinforcers, because of the ammo of all the cool stuff was at home, you know? So just something to be considerate of. When running multiple preference assessment methods and combined data. So sometimes what I would do is I would take the same 6 stimuli or 8 stimuli and do different types of reinforcer assessments, not back to back, maybe like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday or something, and then compare results to get a more comprehensive picture. And that maybe told me a little bit about maybe how they responded to different assessments, etc. And then make decisions on which assessment to conduct based on the learner's skill level. So I think that goes along with what Jenna just said, where what may need to be aware if the client will engage in problem behavior when items are taken away. So when you look at what preference assessment to use, you have to take into consideration things such as skills, as well as variables such as maladaptive behavior when items are removed, etc. So we'll talk about some of those considerations as well. So thank you for bringing that up. So different methods of preference assessments. We have interview, free operant, and trial-based. Interview is simply ask the person, hey, what do you like? What are your favorite things to do? You might also ask the stakeholders, ask their parents. You might do a pre-task choice. What do you want to work for? Or you may have some sort of like menu where you could show them and say, which one of these would you like to work for, as in a list, right? Then we also have free operant assessments. So we have contrived and naturalistic. And then we have trial-based methods, single stimulus, paired stimulus, and multiple stimulus. So putative reinforcer, just a little side note, is something that's labeled as a reinforcer, but not actually shown to function as one by actually changing behavior when it's made response dependent. I have one that comes to mind, but I want to hear, can you guys think of a putative reinforcer? Something that people often attribute to having reinforcing qualities, but are not or may not for all. Um, so the one that The one that I was thinking about was praise. When people assume that praise is going to be a reinforcer, they say, oh, what? But I praised him. I reinforced him. I told him, great job, high five, right? That might be punitive if it does not have putative if it does not have reinforcing value. Right. iPad, maybe. Yeah. I mean, really anything could be putative if you present it assuming it's reinforcing when it's not actually changing behavior. So that's the idea there. Tickle, she had a kid that hated that. Yeah. And sometimes it happens when you have someone who's been in the field for so long and they just assume every child loves bubbles. And it could be a neutral stimulus. It could actually be aversive, right? And then Aram had a good question. She wanted to know about punitive, and punitive has to do with punishments. So a punitive measure might be, timeout or something like that. But again, we know timeout might be reinforcing. So the idea is be careful when we label something as a reinforcer or punisher. Something could be reinforcing, it could be punishing, or it could just be putative or not function as a reinforcer based on the individual. That's why we do these things. Andy, I'm not sure. Andy asks, is a putative reinforcer the same as an arbitrary reinforcer? Let me look into that when we take a break. I haven't heard the word arbitrary reinforcer as like a technical term, but I could be wrong. It makes sense. Okay, so our friend Lisa Hendry Dillon makes some really nice flowcharts. I got to give her credit for this one. Preference assessments, we have asking, trial-based, and observation. Some examples that I have presented are ones that I use. There's a lot of different types of preference assessments. One would be a preference checklist. Then we have our MSW, our multiple stimulus with replacement. With the with replacement, in this example, you present 8 stimuli in a row. You ask them to select an item, then you put the item right back where it was and shift everything. I always did it to the right. I don't think it matters, but you're typically just shifting everything in one position. This helps to control for position bias. And this also helps to just make sure that there's equal opportunities because it's always put back in. Who said, Jenna said, what happens if you have a client who engages in prompt behavior when it's taken away? What happens if you have a client and you ask them to select what they want? You're like, oh, wow, you do like the Play-Doh? That's awesome. And then you take it away from them, put it back in and tell them to make another choice, right? They might be like, well, I just told you what I wanted. That might evoke problem behavior. So that's a consideration for MSWO. You would basically just cross off the item, and then you calculate the number of times in which that item was chosen, and you do the math that way. Obviously, the one that was chosen the most often is going to have the highest relative ranking. MSW is similar in that you lay everything out in order. You ask them, hey, which one do you like? Pick one, show me one, whatever. And then as soon as they choose that item, you remove it from the array and you just tighten the array a little bit. So ultimately it goes from 8 down to 1. The first one that they chose is going to be suggested that one has highest preference value. There are some research, oh man, I want to say Piazza and Fisher, I have to check, that it says that MSWO has a similar functional utility to the other trial-based methods, but is shorter, it's more efficient. Personally, I do MSWO. Most of the time, depending on the learner. But what's great is you can do informal MSWOs where you just have 4 toys. You lay them all out. Hey, what do you like first? Awesome, you chose Play-Doh. Cool, what's next? And you can just do it that way, really informally. And it gives you similar information about a relative preference hierarchy. I also find that MSW, you kind of have to have somebody to help you out a little bit. If you're shifting everything so right, you got kids with like Medusa arms trying to touch all 8 items. You're trying to take data, you're putting it back, moving it. So I feel like MSW is the easiest to do on your own and has good, like I said, functional utility, predictive utility, I should say. Our free operant preference assessment, you just It's just that they're free operant. They're free to choose at any time. You may do a naturalistic where you just allow them to go into the playroom at your clinic. Everything is the way it is. Maybe you go into an assessment room somewhere and just let them decide what it is that they want to play with. You take data on how long they have played with something. So duration is an indicator of preference. And I also like to take data on description of engagement. Did they actually engage with it, or did they just flick the hard plastic with their ring finger? Is that going to tell you they like that item, or they like the sound of the hard finger being flicked, the plastic with the finger being flicked, right? So that helps me to get an idea not only of how long they played with it, but what they did with it. I use the same data sheet for contrived, whereas I would just fill the environment with potentially preferred items. So that's where I might have a phone interview with a mom and say, hey, what are some things they like? She says, cars, bubbles, music, toys, puzzles. Cool, I get all of those things. I put them in a specific area or environment, and I have contrived the situation, but I'm still taking data free operant. They're free to choose. Single stimulus, I've heard of this called go, no go, where they either go to it or they don't go to it. You just present one item at a time. Do they approach it? Do they not approach it? This is good if you have a very early learner who doesn't have scanning and selecting skills, who may have a hard time with making choices or removal of items, maybe don't have things like babbling or pointing. You may just put an item in front of them and record engagement. Do they look at it? Do they turn away from it? Do they make some sort of pushing motion? This just gives you an idea of, are they interested in it at all? Is there an approach or a reject response? So to answer Andy's question, is there criteria on which preference assessments to use? I think you have to consider the following things. Can they scan? If they can scan, the trial-based ones are great. Can they select? In that case, the trial-based ones can be good. Can they tolerate removal of an item? If that's the case, maybe your trial-based ones are not the best because you're presenting them with things, then taking them away, right? So if the children are earlier learners, they might not have those skills, or there is maladaptive behavior present. The free operant or naturalistic the free operant, naturalistic, or contrived ones are good options. So I will get a paired choice, and we'll talk about that after the break also. I must have deleted it. And for the paired choice, you present all of the items in exactly that, paired choices. You might have 6 items, and you present each of them in sets of 2. Once you've presented each of them in sets of 2, you actually switch hands or switch positions. That also accounts for a position bias. And then you calculate the number of times that that item was chosen out of all of the opportunities. Now, the paired choice preference assessment is going to give you the best relative ranking because every item is presented an equal number of times and in different preferences. So you have the exact number of times to choose. The paired choice gives you good information, but it takes forever. So it is one of those things where it takes a long time, and you might get different kinds of like satiation effects, or kids that just say, you have made me choose 36 times what I want. It's not even worth it anymore. Response effort increases. So that's a consideration for that. Monique, it definitely depends. Some people like the MSWO. I prefer without putting it back because this takes longer. You have a lot more stuff going on, and you may have position bias. I know kids who choose everything right down the middle, and you'll see that because they'll choose and they'll choose and they'll choose and they'll choose, and then you're like, they didn't even look. Maybe they didn't have a great scanning repertoire. Or let's say item A is the iPad. Every time they're like, well, you're giving me a choice. I'm going to choose the iPad every single time. What does it tell you about the other stuff? Maybe not as much because the iPad was always present. Whereas with the MSWO, if the iPad's gone, then you have to make a choice between what's left. So those are some considerations to think about. So I will get you paired choice. You guys, looks like you have some experience with preference assessments. Do you always use 8? No. No, you don't always use 8. The paired choice one that I have that I'll show you actually has 6. It's a good idea to use more than 3. Typically, I'd say you use about 5 to 8. Anything more than that's a little too crazy. Anything less than that doesn't give you a big range to go off of. Another great thing you can always do, like I said, is combine them. Do a naturalistic free operant, see what they get, see what they're interested in, then gather those items, then do a trial-based stimulus. If you have a child who does have skills, they can scan, they can select, but they are not maybe paired with you yet, do a single stimulus. And then once you have built a little bit more of a repertoire, then you can start doing those single stimuli they accepted in a more trial-based fashion. So reinforcer assessments. Okay, so we've talked about preference assessments. We're just trying to identify preferences, things that may potential as a reinforcer. Now we're looking at reinforcer assessments. So we actually want to find out by doing a direct data-based assessment to figure out if that behavior functions as a reinforcer, AKA you measure the future effects on the rate of responding. So I had a girl that I was working with, and I was tutoring, and she had a really hard time with the 2, and I said preference assessments are just giving you an idea of things they might be interested in. With reinforcer assessments, you actually do the math. You get numbers. You pit different things against each other to see how it affects the behavior. A concurrent schedule reinforcer assessment, you have 2 stimuli. They're tested against each other by making them contingent upon a behavior and seeing which one produces the greatest increase in responding. So I have 2 reinforcers, and I am trying to see which one produces the greatest increase in responding. So you could do 15 math problems for a Skittle, or you could do your math problems for a cookie. Which one has a greater increase in responding? If it's Skittles, you could say Skittles are a higher reinforcer, have higher reinforcing values, properties. Your multiple schedule reinforcer assessments, you have 2 conditions to compare the effects of the reinforcer. So in condition A, the reinforcer is delivered contingent on the behavior. And in B, our second condition, it's delivered on a non-contingent basis. So I might give you a Skittle for every 5 math problems, or I might just give you non-contingent Skittles every 5 minutes, right? That would be a non-contingent basis, regardless of your behavior. If the response rate increases contingent upon doing that math, then the stimulus is a reinforcer. So just think concurrent choice to looking at the greatest increase in responding. Multiple schedule, and we'll talk about compound schedules of reinforcement a little bit later, but you're basically one's non-contingent, one's contingent. If your response rate is increased in the contingent condition, then that stimulus acts as a reinforcer. And then progressive ratio reinforcer assessment compares the effects of potential reinforcers by gradually increasing the number of responses. So to meet the reinforcement. So if a person will only produce 5 responses for reinforcer A, but 8 for B, then B is a greater reinforcer. So if I will do 15 sheets of homework for a cookie, but I will only do but I'll do 18 for a Skittle, then your Skittle is going to be a greater reinforcer. This one's good for detecting little differences in reinforcer effectiveness. Progressive ratio, you progressively increase the ratio response requirement to see how many responses will be emitted by the individual based upon which reinforcer they're, quote, kind of like working for. You're going to want to do concurrent schedules. You typically want it to be the same behavior. You typically want it to be the same behavior that you're looking at because let's say math has a lot more response effort than reading. I mean, I would do 5,000 pages of homework to, every 1 page of statistics. I'd rather read 5 articles than do 1 statistics problem right now. So that probably wouldn't be a good idea. You'd want to do the same behavior, right? 5 do 5 math problems for Skittles or read 5 words for Skittles or the other one? Yeah, right. So I hope I answered that. So progressive, you progressively increase. And this one is used for detecting little differences. I saw a question once upon a time about two things that were had very similar reinforcing value, but they wanted to detect a very fine difference. Then you'd look at progressive ratio. And I just think progressive because it slowly increases, gives you more finer details. And then potential punishers. So punisher assessment is basically a punisher where you are going to do a database method to present different stimuli, and you're going to try to measure the effects to see which one has more punishing properties. So an advantage is the sooner an effective punisher can be identified, the sooner it can be used to decrease behavior. So if you are at the point where you're choosing to do a punisher, to use a punishing stimulus to decrease behavior for whatever reason, you want to make sure you choose wisely what you're going to use, right? We talk about the potential side effects of punishment. One way to do that is to do a punisher assessment. So you would present different adverse things and see which one has the most adverse reaction. Punisher assessments can also inform us of the intensity of the punisher. So you can figure out what the effective level or magnitude is of that punisher. And then you use that data to develop a hypothesis about the relative effectiveness of each stimulus change as a punisher. So remember, we only want to use the smallest intensity of the punisher that's still effective. Very often, we probably, I'm going to say collectively, don't have a lot of experience with using punishers. We typically, our funding sources, wherever we work, typically rely only on reinforcers or mostly on reinforcers. If you choose to use a punisher, it is important to do some sort of punisher assessment, even if it's just presenting the different items and recording the reaction. I believe I said about progressive ratio that it's good for detecting little differences in reinforcer effectiveness. Because it's progressive, you're slowly increasing the response requirement, the number of responses needed to meet that reinforcement. So that might give you information about if I'll do 5 math work problems for A, but I'll do 8 for B, then B is a greater reinforcer. The fact that we have, how many responses versus the next responses for the next stimulus, it gives you better information about detecting small differences. Okay. All right, super. So let's talk about fundamentals of behavior change. Unless anyone has any questions or feedback that you have about preference assessments. So we're going to kind of take a big step back to the beginning, and we're going to talk about behavior, response, and response class. Your behavior is the activity of living organisms. It is technically the interaction of the muscles and glands of a live organism and the environment. So it's the interaction of the organism and its environment. Your response is a single instance or occurrence of a specific type of behavior. So they're not AKAs. Your response class there's 2 different types of response classes. We have our topographical response class, where it's a group of 2 or more responses that share the common form or topography. Your functional response class is different. The behaviors or the responses are topographically different, but they have the same effect on the environment. Therefore, these responses produce a specific class of reinforcers. So I have 2 behaviors, 2 responses that are topographically different. I have kicking and hitting, but they produce attention. They produce socially mediated positive reinforcement. That is the effect in the environment that they have, and that is a specific class of reinforcer that kicking and hitting both produce. That's what makes them members of the same class. Your antecedent class, stimulus class, are a group of stimuli that share specified common elements. Your formal antecedent class is described by physical features. So the stimuli are frequently described, manipulated, and measured according to the dimension of behavior, or that dimension. its physical features. The way I think about it is they look alike, they sound alike, they smell alike, whatever it should be. They're formal physical features. Temporal antecedent stimulus class has to do with stimuli which occur in regards to the behavior of interest. So a couple different types of temporal stimulus class have to do with antecedents and consequences, right? So when are they occurring with regards to behavior interest? Before as an antecedent or after as a consequence? And then you have your functional antecedent stimulus class, and that is described as its effects on behavior. So stimulus classes are best conceptualized through a functional analysis of behavior, and they have one or two effects: immediate but temporary effects of the decrease or increase in the current frequency of behavior, and or it can be delayed but mostly permanent effect on behavior. It was like hidden mystery ink there. So the functional has to do with, it has a immediate or temporary effect, or a delayed but a permanent effect functionally. And then we have our environment, which is just a conglomerate of real circumstances in which the organism or a reference part of the organism exists. So questions that you might see about environment just have to do with the fact that the individual operates on its environment. The behavior can't exist in the absence of the environment. So we can't just say, oh, he kicked. There's got to be the antecedents, the consequences. Those all have to do with the real circumstances around. And they can include other aspects of the organism. So remember, we are radical behaviorists, so we talk about covert or physical events that are inside the skin. So the environment is not just physically what you see, it also has to do with that covert behavior inside the skin. That's your total environment. We're going to talk about feature and arbitrary stimulus class today, or maybe next week, depends on how timing goes, when we look at stimulus equivalence and concept formation, or equivalence class formation, I should say. Good question. And then your stimulus is an energy change that affects the organism through its receptor cells. So you may have interoceptive or exteroceptive, inside or outside. All right, stimulus control. Stimulus control is kind of what it's all about, right? When we are trying to teach people, we are looking at what kind of things can affect behavior change. We have identified potential reinforcers. We have identified environmental arrangements in order to change that behavior, but we need to make sure that we develop stimulus control. That way we are able to make the behavior change we want to make only under the conditions in which we expect them to, or we want them to, right? So stimulus control occurs when the rate, latency, duration, or amplitude of a response is altered in the presence of an antecedent stimulus class. So just kind of to go backwards here a little bit, there needs to be the presence of the antecedent stimulus class. If you're going to say it's stimulus control, a specific antecedent must be present. And in the presence of that antecedent stimulus class, is some dimension of that behavior altered? That's when we can say that we have stimulus control. It's acquired when responses are reinforced only in the presence of a stimulus class. And that is known as the discriminative stimulus, or your SD, and not in the presence of other stimuli or your S deltas. So stimulus control is all about SDs and S deltas, and we'll give some examples in a moment. Faulty stimulus control, target behavior comes under the restricted control of an irrelevant stimulus class. So that's when you have a child who they first learn what a dog is, and every animal with 4 legs is a dog, because that behavior has come under the control of an irrelevant or a specific. Let me take a step back. Let's say you have a child that has a specific dog, and he's only a dog because of that one irrelevant antecedent stimulus. So somebody give me an example of like like a bulldog that snores, let's just say, right? And that's how he labeling that dog a dog is coming under control, not of all of the things that make a dog, but that irrelevant antecedent stimulus. He needs to hear that dog or that slobber or whatever it is. That is the faulty stimulus control that has been developed. Then we have overgeneralization or loose stimulus control, where the individual emits response in the presence of stimuli that are similar to instructional stimuli, but are inappropriate occasions. So that's where every animal with 4 legs is now a dog. You show them a picture of a horse and they're like, that's a dog. It has loose stimulus control and he is overgeneralized. So you conceptualize them as opposites, right? Faulty is too narrow, irrelevant antecedent stimulus. Overgeneralization is too wide or too loose. Stimulus salience is a pretty cool thing. There's a lot of great articles, scientific research on different kinds of stimulus salience. But the salience of the stimulus influences attention to the stimulus, and therefore ultimately the development of stimulus control. So salient clues include specific rooms, color, or people. Some stimuli have more salience of others depending on sensory capabilities, right? So you do need to take that into consideration. A salient cue that for you may not be a salient cue for another individual. Salience refers to how obvious or prominent a stimulus is in the person's environment. So in this example, in which picture does the stop sign stand out? This is why when we start teaching, maybe selecting items, we prefer to use just a table with less clutter. We might want to use pictures that have just a plain white background with all kinds of other things going on. Because on the left we have the red pops out against the grass in the background, whereas it has decreased stimulus salience for the right one because there's other stop signs and it's red and everything like that. Highlighting different types of highlighting different so increasing the salience has to do with basically development of stimulus control. So you may want to increase the salience of an item while you're teaching in order to facilitate efficiency of instruction. Development of stimulus control is just basically we're all comfortable with our ABC paradigm. We have your SD where the telephone rings, response, you pick up the ring, and it's reinforced why you get a friendly conversation. Therefore, in the future, a telephone rings, what do? You pick it up. Here's our ABCs of behavior. But your ABCs of behavior, your stimulus control is only developed because of our S delta, in which case the doorbell rings, you go over, you pick up your phone and you say hello. You are not delivered any reinforcement. Nobody speaks to you on your phone. So what happens next time the doorbell rings? You are not likely to pick up the phone because it has not been reinforced. It's the absence of that reinforcement. Here we go. I knew I wanted to talk about this. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about salience. Monique had a good question. If you're teaching the letter A, you may want to write it on a plain white piece of paper instead of a glittery paper for stimulus salience. You want to make sure that the thing that you're teaching, quote, pops out, because we want to make sure that it's more obvious or prominent in their backgrounds. We want to make sure that that learner doesn't learn the letter A under some sort of faulty stimulus control, where maybe the glitter it contributes to A-ness, the letter A, what he has learned about the letter A. So it's a good way to increase the facilitation of the efficiency of instruction. Now, of course, you want to make sure that you are embedding multiple exemplars and you're doing different ways to teach for generalization. So you don't always want to do everything on a plain white background, but this is an example of how that would facilitate efficiency of instruction, especially immediately. In the beginning. So a couple different types of stimulus salience. These things affect stimulus salience. Masking. I have highlighted what I think is the kind of the important parts of these two because they get a little confusing. With your masking, the salience of the stimulus is decreased. the competing stimulus blocks the evocative power of the stimulus, which decreases its effectiveness. So for masking, I just think of blocking evocative stimulus. I actually think of a piece of masking tape that's blocking some sort of evocative stimuli. That's what works for me to picture it. So an example, a student may know the answer to teacher's question. So teacher's question typically has stimulus control and evokes the correct response. But since there are peers here, that's a competing contingency. It blocks the evocative power of the teacher's question. Masking, on the other hand, has to do with the acquisition of stimulus control. So the presence of one stimulus condition interferes with acquisition of stimulus control of another. So if I have the television on and I'm calling for, my child to come to dinner and they don't hear me, that my instruction, the stimulus control of the TV, is interfering with the acquisition of the stimulus control of me asking them to come to dinner. So that has to do with competing contingencies, right? Competing conditions. Whereas masking just has to do with evocative stimuli. Okay, Andy had a good question. Could a block tape cover the letters for a stop sign be considered masking? If the letters were the evocative stimulus for stopping, then yes. But think about it this way. For you and me, if you saw, sorry, I wanna, we are, however old we are, if you saw this sign without the letters, you just saw that hexagon, a red hexagon, you would know that that's a stop sign, right? So if the letters were the reason why you stopped and the black tape over it did block the evocative effect of that sign, then yes, that could be considered masking. So is this true? In overshadowing, the person knows the response, but it's being overshadowed by something else. Yeah, you could just be careful when you're using words like no, but yes, for overshadowing, there is still that stimulus control there. I still would come to dinner when mom calls me, right? It's not that one stimulus is competing over the evocative power of that. It just has to do with one is kind of overshadowing or interfering with the acquisition. Interfering. How do we reduce the effects of masking and shadowing? So here's the important part. Make sure you're arranging the environment to reduce noise from unwanted stimulus. So if I'm trying to teach you to work on a math question, and I know that their peers being around are going to block the evocative power of me asking you to do some sort of math equation, I might want to reduce the peers in the room. I might want to make the instructional stimuli intense or increase maybe the salience there. And then I might want to consistently reinforce behavior in the presence of the desired stimulus. So I would make sure that I have developed stimulus control, very tight stimulus control. That way when other things come into the room that may compete, you will still respond. Or if there's another stimulus in the environment, that stimulus doesn't overshadow my instruction. Right. So Jenna said, in overshadowing, the person cannot learn it. So I'm trying to teach my dog to learn a trick, but they're so focused on the treat that he can't learn the trick. So we're looking at the competing stimulus conditions interfering with the acquisition of the stimulus control. Right. So masking, there is stimulus control, but one competing stimulus is blocking the actual evocative power of that stimulus. With overshadowing, we have another stimulus who is sort of blocking over that. Okay. There you go. That's what I meant to do. All right, so stimulus discriminations and conditional discriminations. A discriminated operant is reinforced or not reinforced based upon the presence of another antecedent stimulus. So we're going to talk about STs and S deltas to answer your question. Fresquita. Discriminative control is when an individual responds consistently in the presence of a particular antecedent stimulus or stimuli. The presence is said to be under the control of the stimulus or those stimuli. So discrimination is evident when a particular behavior is more likely to occur in the presence of SDs and in the absence of your S deltas. So what does that mean? What's an SD and an S delta? This is from educateautism.com. I like this website a lot. It has a great explanation on discrimination learning, conditional discrimination, and discrimination training procedures. The basic idea is that if I am trying to get a learner to point to B, the discriminative point to B is your SD. Everything else is an S delta. In the presence of me saying point to B, when you point to B, reinforcement is delivered. Therefore, in the presence of that stimuli, you are going to point to B. Educateautism.com. It's listed right here. In the presence of point to B and you point to H, reinforcement will not be delivered. Therefore, the H stimuli is now a discriminative delta. So the effectiveness of your discriminative stimuli derives from a learner's history. You don't just point to B and I reinforce you one time. That's not going to make it a discriminative stimulus. There needs to be a history of reinforcement, punishment, and or extinction when those stimuli are present. The effectiveness of your SD derives from the consequences that are associated with that stimuli and your history of differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just basically is composed of two basic components. We have reinforcing the appropriate response in the presence of some stimuli and not reinforcing it, putting it on extinction, or reinforcing with lesser amount or quality in the presence of others. That is how you develop your SDs and your S deltas. Okay, so B is your SD. Everything else does not result in reinforcement, therefore, or less reinforcement. Therefore, they may become S deltas. So stimulus discrimination is I say which one is a dog. That is an SD for you to select a dog. That is an S delta. The cat and the horse are S deltas. You do not select them because you're not going to be reinforced for that. Now, I wanted to point out one thing is this. Okay, so it is true that when we are teaching one thing, we want to reinforce the behavior we want to see under the control of the S delta. That's how we develop stimulus control. But if you are you may also reinforce that, but less. Let me put it this way. I have two sisters and I was always growing up and my mom always called us by each other's names, right? Typically, if she said Trudy, I would respond and go over to her or whatever. But she was always calling me by my sister's name. Sometimes the dog's name was thrown in there. There were some times when I did respond to her just because it's like, I know who she was talking to, right? Now, Joey, my sister's name, is actually, would be an S delta because my name is Trudy, it's not Joey, but I was reinforcing it with lesser amount or quality. So your S deltas do not mean that it's totally the absence of reinforcement or the absence of that response. It just has to be lesser quality. Yeah, so Brianna, every once in a while you were like, whatever, I know who she means, and you just answered, right? Right. So now, but over time, if you responded more often to your sister's name, who's, whatever, let's say your sister is Brooke, over time, then she's going to have less stimulus control because you do come to Brooke 50% of the time, right? So you just need to make sure that it's reinforced in a lesser amount or quality. So, and the same goes with differential reinforcement. The question, the actual dog picture is the SD. Yep. So your SD is actually discriminative stimulus. So that is the discriminative stimulus that you say, which is the dog, and you choose the picture of the dog. So that is the stimulus in the presence of which selecting the dog has resulted in reinforcement. Stimulus over selectivity. What if you, yeah, exactly. So Melissa said if you said which one is the cat, the picture of the cat would become the SC and the other ones would be the S deltas, absolutely. So remember, your SD is the discriminative stimulus. It's the stimulus present when in the presence of the dog or the cat, if I say where's the cat and you choose that stimulus, that's stimulus control. If I say jump and you jump, that's stimulus control. If I say jump and you kick, I'm not going to give you reinforcement, right? Or I'm going to reinforce you less. That's a development of stimulus control. Stimulus over selectivity is when the individual focuses on only one aspect of an object or environment while ignoring the other aspects. So have you ever had a learner and you're trying to ask them a question, they only listen, they only tune in when you give a specific stimulus, or they only focus on one aspect of the environment while ignoring other aspects? That means that your stimulus control is too narrow. We have stimulus over selectivity. Stimulus generalization occurs when stimuli that share physical characteristics with the controlling response evoke the same behavior. So I show you all of these dogs and you say dogs. They share similar physical characteristics with the controlling stimulus, and they evoke the same behavior. In this case, it's saying dogs. If you can label the pug, then you can label the German Shepherd. So stimulus generalization and discrimination exist on a continuum, whereas generalization, stimuli that share similar physical characteristics evoke the same response. Discrimination, when new stimuli that are similar to the controlling response do not evoke the same response. Now, here is a quick depiction of the degree of stimulus generalization and discrimination. So I believe this is from the online Cooper modules. But basically, this would just be an example. I've seen the term generalization gradient before. It's basically the degree of stimulus generalization and discrimination. In this example, they are teaching the color yellow, I believe. All right, so concept formation is where the magic happens. It's an example of stimulus control that requires discrimination between classes of stimuli and generalization within a class of stimuli. So if I am trying to teach Melissa the concept of dog, I need to teach her to generalize within all dogs, different features of dogs, right? Different sounds dogs may make. Some dogs yip, some dogs woof. Then I need to make sure that I teach her discrimination between dogs and other animals. So although dogs and horses have 4 legs and may have fluffy tails, what are some other discriminations? Horses have longer faces, dogs have whiskers. I don't think horses have whiskers. Obviously I'm a city girl. Or dog toys versus other toys, right? I might teach you, and by that I meant stuffed animals versus other stuffed animals. So concept formation, generalization within, discrimination between. Right? Response generalization is generality, one of our 7 dimensions of ABA. The extent to which a learner emits untrained responses that are functionally equivalent to the trained target behavior. So response generalization recurs to the occurrence of variations in behavior that contribute to shaping new behaviors. So in this instance, we have a response generalization, the occurrence of a functionally equivalent untrained form of a trained response. So I have people that often get little mixed up with response generalization and stimulus generalization. This was one of those concepts that really I couldn't get a handle on for some reason. So I'm going to kind of show you something that I had done for myself for both times I took the exam. This is a whiteboard trick that I did where I just wrote, as soon as I sat down and I brain dumped, sure, Annie, definitely please feel free to use this. As soon as I sat down at the exam, I did exactly this. I wrote down an R, and then I wrote R, 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 and S, right? And then I did the same thing for this. And the way I see it is when you get a question, you plug it in, right? And then you see If there are more responses than there are stimuli, a lot of R's, it's response generalization. If there's a lot of S's going on, then you have stimulus generalization. So in this example, we have calling your cat Goldie, Miss Whiskers, Honey Bear, and Meowsers. We have like 15 names for our dogs. We have Miss Whiskers, we have Honey Bear, we have Meowsers, and we have only one stimulus, and that's the cat Goldie. So I would write it out exactly like that, plug it in, and I'd say, okay, I got one S, oops, that should be an S. I have one S and a lot of R's, therefore it's response generalization. Same question here. For stimulus generalization, calling your cat, your friend's cat, and your neighbor's cat all Goldie, I have cat one, I have my cat, I have my friend's cat, and I have my neighbor's cat, but it evokes only one response, therefore, which is cat or Goldie, therefore that's stimulus generalization. A lot of S's, it's stimulus. So the cat is the stimulus that's present. So you walk in a room and there's one stimulus. Here's the cat, here's Goldie. And there's 3 different things that you can call her, 3 different responses. Sometimes I call her over by saying, hey Goldie, hey Miss Whiskers, it's time for dinner. Sometimes hey Honey Bear. There's one stimulus, only one Goldie, but a lot of different responses. Therefore, response generalization. Then in this situation, I have 3 cats, therefore 3 stimulus. Those are cats if you can't see that. These are 3 cats, but they evoke only one response. That is going to be stimulus generalization. A lot of stimuli, one response. Okay, I hope that helps. This is definitely one of those things I would recommend throwing down on your whiteboard as soon as you get there, because you're likely going to see a question with these. And in my experience, people kind of freeze up. They're like, oh no, I hate these. I get so confused. It's real easy if you plug it in. Which one would you work with a person first? That's another good question, Andy. He said, which one would you work on with a person first, stimulus or response? Would it depend on what you're trying to teach them? I'm going to say it is going to depend, but I think you need to work at both at the same time. You would want to make sure that you have an individual who can do many responses in the presence of one stimulus. If I say hello, I want you to respond, hey, what's up? How are you? Wave, because we don't want rote memorization where it's under your behavior restricted to only one response in the presence of the same stimulus. But you also want to make sure that you greet me other times outside of just me saying, hello, Andy, right? So you need to wave when I say, hey, how are you? Nice to see you, high five, or whatever it may be. So that's kind of a good question. You want to make sure that you embed for generalization as soon as possible with your learners. Stimulus and response generalization is one of the barriers teaching students with autism disorder, because they often come under very restricted control, narrow stimulus control over selectivity. Okay, so let's practice these. I would recommend that you guys maybe draw this thing on your, if you have a little piece of scrap paper or something like that, and then practice inserting these questions. Okay, and you can write your answers to me privately so you don't have any reactivity. Number 1, during discrete trial training, a child was taught to point to objects instead of pointing. He now sometimes puts his whole hands on the objects. This change in behavior is blank. Number 2, this is the extent to which a learner emits untrained responses that are functionally equivalent to the trains a target behavior. And number 3, which is an example of stimulus generalization. Joel, a middle schooler, says great when asked how are you, and also when Joel says what's up. Shaylee, a 6-year-old, being able to tell the difference between chickens and ducks. C, 2-year-old Sam thinking all men with beards are scary since Sam has a beard and his uncle yelled at Sam. Or D, 4-year-old Max being able to pick a wolf out of an array of pictures that includes a wolf, a dog, and a wolverine. Okay, so number one, response generalization. We have, I present to you a stimulus and you show me different types of responses. Therefore, it's response generalization. You are pointing to something, you're putting your hands to something, etc. Great. And response generalization is the extent to which the learner emits untrained responses that are functionally equivalent to the target behavior. And then for number three, we'll do our, gonna do like this. I don't know if this is gonna work. Oh, there we go. So we have Joel. We have Joel who is a middle schooler, and he says great, which is his response, and he is given multiple greetings. Somebody says, how are you? Here's stimulus one. Someone says, what's up? That's stimulus two, and he greets with the same response. Therefore, a lot of S's, one R, stimulus generalization. Okay, just for fun, what is B and D? Those are discrimination. Those are, I'm presenting you with an array of animals and I say, find the chicken. You are discriminating amongst chicken and ducks. Or in example D, I give you an array of a wolf, a dog, and a wolverine, and I say, show me the wolf. That is stimulus generalization, discrimination. Great. Now, how about overgeneralization would be is if I presented you with a wolverine and you said wolf, or I presented you with all of those and you said dog for all of those. Good. All right, so I'm just gonna finish up this last one, then we'll take a little break. Multiple functions of a single stimulus. Behavior altering effects often have behavior altering events that typically have more than one effect. Many responses may occur in the presence of one stimulus. So just the idea that if you have a headache, you'll do everything that helped to alleviate a headache in the past. You may take over-the-counter medication, lay down, rest, turn off lights, etc. So there's one stimulus and there may be multiple functions, multiple responses. I believe Jack Michael said something like multiple functions is the rule, not the exception, right? So just to be clear that behavior altering effects typically have more than one effect. Okay, so to answer some of the questions you guys had. Okay, so Jenna, the question about progressive ratio, I believe the question was something along the lines of, if Brooke is reinforced by Netflix and time on the iPad, what is one way that you can try to figure out which of the two stimuli are more reinforcing? Your progressive ratio schedule. Something along the lines of, if both are known reinforcers, but we want to find out a small difference in which one has a higher reinforcing value, which one would you use? Which preference assessment would give you that information? Something along those lines, because it talked about what was it? Detecting little differences in reinforcing assessment effectiveness. That was the key that pointed out to me, okay, we're going to do a progressive ratio preferences reinforcer assessment and try to detect a small difference in the effectiveness of Netflix over the iPad. Something like that. Frasquita said, does multiple functions mean multiple responses every time? Typically, so here's an example that I just came to my mind is a yellow stoplight, right? And depending upon the situation, it can either tell you to slow down or speed up. So one stimulus can evoke different responses based upon the conditions around it. Okay, looks like we are all caught up. So let's talk about, all right, so antecedent interventions. We talked about our STs. Our STs evoke behavior due to a past correlation with increased availability of reinforcement, right? In the presence of that ST, you continue to emit that behavior because of the potential availability of reinforcement or the differential history of reinforcement. Your MOs, we're going to talk a lot more about MOs next week, but your MOs increase the current frequency of behavior when an effective reinforcer is not available. Each has different implications for how behavior change strategies should be implemented and manipulated. So we're going to talk a lot about the difference between STs and MOs, but basically, in a nutshell, your STs evoke the behavior because of the past correlation or association with reinforcement. Your MOs increase the frequency of that behavior. When we talk about antecedent-based interventions, and this is something that I'm guilty of, I sometimes use these words interchangeably. But if you want to be specific, antecedent procedure, control, manipulations, and interventions are technically different because because we need to look at the functions of each of the strategies. So we have contingency dependent and contingency independent antecedent-based interventions. Our contingency dependent antecedent-based interventions are exactly that. They are dependent on the consequence of the behavior for developing evocative and abative effects. So an antecedent control strategy we may use is an antecedent strategy where the consequences of the behavior are important, basically, okay? So the example is 2 + 2 = 4. The student responds 4 because responding the number 4 has been reinforced in the past. So the reinforcement is dependent, the consequence, which is me saying, yes, that's right, it is 4, is going to be, your behavior depends upon that. A better example, I think, of an antecedent manipulation we might use is, let's say we do flashcards, right? I would present you with the number 4. In the past, maybe I would present you with the number 4, I'm doing some sort of errorless learning procedure. So therefore, this would be antecedent control because you are going to respond 4 because 4 has control. That's kind of the way I think about this. This antecedent intervention is dependent upon this consequence. Without this consequence, we don't have antecedent control. That's the development of the response that we're looking for. Most interventions that we use where we are trying to teach a specific skill and we arrange the environment in order to have the response control the behavior is contingency dependent. We're going to talk a little bit more today about contingency independent responses. They are not dependent on the consequence of behavior for developing evocative and abative effects. The antecedent itself affects the behavior-consequence relations. So these are known as antecedent intervention. I can't necessarily imagine a question on the exam that's going to trick you by saying antecedent intervention or control, but just know that I have seen things about contingency independent or contingency dependent antecedent-based interventions. So for something to be contingency independent, it means obviously it's not dependent upon consequence. Okay, so the contingency does not have to do with the consequence of the behavior. So an example, we're going to talk more about these, are contingency independent interventions. Sleep deprivation can influence the occurrence and problem behavior, but there's no history. So there's never been a time in the past when Andy did not sleep and he cried and mom comforted him. He didn't learn that crying gets me attention because in the past, in that similar situations, I cried, right? There's no previous history. There's no specific learning history. Therefore, it's not antecedent control. It could be considered antecedent intervention. So these are our contingency independent antecedent interventions. These interventions have do not require previous history. They do not require a learning contingency, and therefore these are considered antecedent interventions. Antecedent. Yes, when we look at, so we typically put them over the entire we typically classify them all as antecedent interventions. I specify antecedent control as contingency dependent because I think of that as it needs to be dependent upon that contingency in order to have control, right? Just like stimulus control is dependent upon the availability or the reinforcing contingency. It's contingent, it's dependent on that consequence. So super good question. So our contingency independent antecedent interventions are NCR, high probability request sequence, and FCT, or functional communication training. These interventions can influence the occurrence of behavior in the absence of a history of pairing. So when it boils down to it, antecedent control, you have to have learning history in order for it to exert antecedent control. For these interventions, you don't need to have a learning contingency. And these interventions can influence control. They can influence the occurrences of behavior in the absence of that history. So NCR, note on the task list, it's actually listed as presenting stimuli with known reinforcing properties. There's some people that say NCR is not actually a reinforcement procedure at all, so it's actually referred to as presenting stimuli with known reinforcing properties. So it's a little FYI there. I have seen questions that list it as such. NCR, you are presenting stimuli with known reinforcing properties, and they are delivered on a fixed time or variable time independent of the learner's behavior. So it's the time is fixed or variable. You present that stimuli independent of the learner's behavior. This may effectively decrease the problem behavior because the reinforcers that maintain the problem behavior are available freely and frequently. See this a lot too, freely and frequently. NCR works because it functions as an abolishing operation. So before we start an antecedent intervention, what's the most important thing we do? We need to make sure we have correctly identified the maintaining consequences or contingencies of that reinforcement, right? We need to do our FBA, figure out what information, gather the information, and figure out what's reinforcing, what's maintaining this behavior. And it could be either positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or automatic reinforcement. We need to know that. Why? Because if we're going to create an abolishing operation, we're going to present that item or that stimulus freely and frequently. We need to be presenting the right thing. If Lindsay wants attention and her behavior is maintained by socially mediated positive attention, and I'm allowing her to escape freely and frequently, I am not going to be abolishing anything, right? I'm not meeting that need, so to speak. Advantages of NCR, they're easier to apply. They create a positive learning environment, especially when it comes to praise, NCR plus extinction may reduce extinction bursts, so the combination of the two can be beneficial, and they can strengthen and maintain the desirable behaviors. Some disadvantages or considerations to think about are that free access to your NCR stimuli may reduce motivation to engage in the adaptive behavior. So if Lindsay's behavior is maintained by socially mediated positive reinforcement, and I provide attention on a variable time of 2 minutes, then maybe manning for attention may be reduced because she's getting so much attention, right? It could also strengthen the problem behavior. So there's that chance pairing. If right on her variable time of 2 minutes, I'm about to give her attention, she kicks me in the shin, I may strengthen that shin kicking behavior just because of the temporal contiguity, of me giving her that attention. That is a disadvantage to consider. And then NCR escape can disrupt the instructional process. Have any of you guys ever used an NCR escape procedure, or is there anything you'd like to add about NCR? So I had a learner who he was super smart. He was just a really great student, and then at a certain point, he had been in the clinic for a couple years, and the value of escape was very high. So we did some different antecedent arrangements. We tried some CMORs, and ultimately we decided to do an NCE. So we did non-contingent escape. And while he was working at the table or in some sort of instructional setting, on a variable time of 2 minutes, we let him just run. We said, okay, go. And he would just roll off the chair and just be silly and go play. And over time, it was variable. He didn't know when that time was coming, you know. And so over time, then we increased the schedule. So then he could only get NCR every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. And by the end of it, he was only getting that escape maybe once or twice during the entire 6-hour day he was there. So you do have to be mindful of that, because like Lindsay said, NCR escape can disrupt the instructional process. He was literally we would say, okay, go play. And he'd roll out of the chair onto the floor, and it was a whole big fun thing. And then we'd say, okay, let's go back. And he would get back to work. So you do need to be mindful of it can disrupt the instructional process. However, if you plan this well and you're able to thin out that schedule so they are able to access that non-contingently less frequently, you can go back and say learning can happen, because we are now satiating them, creating an abolishing operation. So like I said, you use a fixed time or variable time. Establishing the initial schedule is crucial and can impact the overall effectiveness of the intervention. Recommendation is to start with the dense schedule and then thin it by adding small increments of time. You can do that by adding a constant time, 5 seconds, proportional time based upon proportional to the amount of time that they're able to increase sitting in the table. Maybe you might add time proportionally, and then session to session, that might be you change it based on how things are going, right? Only thin the schedule after the initial NCR interval has been produce a reduction in problem behavior. So just like schedules of reinforcement, right? You have to be mindful. You need to make sure that you are planning appropriately. Lindsay, NCRs, NCE, NCA can be awesome. The big challenge I've had is having people non-contingently reinforce. We spend our whole lives contingently reinforcing, right? We praise kids for doing the right thing. We praise, our partners for doing the dishes. We give people cookies based upon getting good grades, whatever it may be. Then you're trying to train people to reinforce the kid by letting him roll out of the chair and get out of doing work, right? Or I'm going to give you attention regardless of what you're doing. That's the hard part. It works like magic for the kids if you've identified the right function. And yes, that chance pairing can be a consideration, but if you've timed it right and you have thinned your schedule appropriately, that consideration will go down as long as you are also teaching adaptive skills at the same time. That's a good question, Andy. That's a great question. He said, can this lead to superstitious behavior? If there is a chance pairing and it happens like one time, probably not. If it happens very often, I don't know that would be, Superstitious behavior has to do with superstitious manding. So they would have to be manding for something when you look at superstitious mans. So they might have to be saying like, I wish I could have a cookie, right, when you give them a cookie, or I wish mom would pay attention to me, or something like that. I wish the light would turn green would be a better one. I think it's more like the temporal contiguity could reinforce that behavior. Superstitious behavior could be a mentalistic thing. I think Andy was talking a little bit about superstitious and magical manding. Both are actual things that we do, and because of the chance that behavior that you superstitiously manned for happens, it increases it in the future. Yeah. I think that you should look at these. Look at the different ways to thin the NCR interval, constant, proportional, and session to session. I wouldn't worry too much about them. Just know the most important thing would be that you know that you need to thin your schedules. You need to set the initial time schedule, and we'll talk about that right now. And then you need to make sure that you thin them as quickly as possible, either doing a constant time or do it session to session. So we have set our schedule. How do we do that? We determine the initial NCR schedule. We divide the total duration of all baseline sessions by the total number of occurrences of the problem behavior. So I had Jenna, and Jenna is, anytime I place a demand or when she's in a demand condition, she rolls off the chair onto the floor. I take a duration of the baseline session and I count the number of times that she rolls off of the chair or engages in other behavior to escape the demand. And that's how I set my session. That's how I set my interval. So in 60 minutes, Jenna rolled off the chair 60 times. That's going to be a quotient of 60 seconds, right? So every 1 minute or so. So I'm going to set my interval slightly below every 1 minute. So that's actually how we did this with this learner. We figured out how much time he was at the table in that instruction, how many times he rolled off the floor, and it turned out to be right around 2.5 minutes. So I set the initial interval at 2 minutes. This is more important to know this. So identify the reinforcer, we've done our FBA, we set our interval, we use our timing device, we choose either a fixed time or a variable time, we deliver the maintaining reinforcer non-contingent of their behavior, we collect the data, and we thin the schedule. This is probably the most important thing. Melissa, awesome question as well. Fixed time and fixed interval it's the same concept. It's not the same thing. Fixed time is just basically going to be like when your timer goes off, so every 2 minutes, every 5 minutes. Your intervals are actually your schedule of reinforcement that's set in actual intervals. Like we might do an interval of working for 10 minutes or something like that. So technically it works the same way, where it's fixed, it's the same, it doesn't change, or it's variable, it changes. All right, advantages. I think we talked a little bit about this, which is that they're easy to implement. Our NCRs don't teach replacement behavior. They may strengthen the behavior you're trying to decrease. They can be ineffective. When is it not a good idea to use NCRs? These are important. NCR can be ineffective when long history of intermittent reinforcement schedules. So if you have been intermittently reinforcing for escaping a behavior, that would be not a good time to do this. Other weak reinforcers are maintaining the problem behavior. So let's just say that I am trying to teach, we're doing an NCR because Jenna keeps trying to escape the table. However, when she rolls on the floor, she gets a little bit of attention from her, RBTs or her parents or whatever also. And if we do not control for that, that attention may continue to operate during NCR. Then that's a consideration we need to look at, right? Because often behaviors are controlled by multiple function. They're maintained by different things, so we need to control for both of those things. Reinforcers are not, and the behavior is being supported by circumstances other than reinforcing contingencies. When we have a chance and we do put in interventions, we always want to look at some sort of replacement behavior. It can be a good idea to create an abolishing operation, but it's not necessarily sustainable because we're not teaching anything. Okay? So schedules of reinforcement, such as intervals, have to do with you are reinforcing behaviors. So we set our interval and your responding happens during that interval. So if you're on an FI of 5 minutes, you're responding during those, at the end of that 5 minutes, the next correct response acts as reinforcement. Non-contingent reinforcement, you're being reinforced regardless of responding. There's no contingent response. Schedules of reinforcement are contingent upon responding. So, right. Next up, when we talk about our antecedent independent interventions, high probability request sequence, which is referred to as high P request sequence. Your high probability request sequence involves presentation of a series of easy to follow requests. Important that the person has a history of compliance. They have to be able to perform that. These skills need to be in their repertoire. And the individual complies with several high P requests. Then you provide them with the target request, which is typically your low P, your low probability request. So high P, high P, high P, and then your low P. You're going to select 2 to 5 short tasks and then present the low probability request. It's really important that you do it fast, you do it efficiently, you need to make sure you're doing skills that are definitely in their repertoire. If you go over and you just start barking demands, assuming it's gonna be high probability, but those are not skills that have been mastered or in their repertoires, they're not technically high probability, right? A variety of terms, and Annie's all over it. We may also call this behavioral momentum, interspersed requests, pre-task requests, but most of the time we refer to it as a high probability request sequence. They need to be presented in rapid succession. Your low probability request should immediately follow the reinforcer for the high probability compliance. So that means if you've complied in the 3 high Ps, I have 3 high probability discriminative stimulus I presented, immediately present your low probability request. And make sure you use high quality positive stimuli or positive reinforcement immediately following the compliance in order to increase the effectiveness of the intervention. So that reinforcement needs to come right after the low probability request. It is important to acknowledge compliance, but don't stop your cycle or your momentum with praise for the high probability request. You might say like, hey, great job, but keep going. Make sure that you continue rapidly build that momentum by rapid succession with short inter-trial, inter-request intervals. Functional communication training is your FCT establishes an appropriate communicative behavior to compete with problem behaviors associated with the EO. So this is important here is that in contrast to NCR and high probability request sequence, your FCT actually develops behaviors that are sensitive to your establishing operations. That's what FCT is, right? We figure out what you are motivated for and we teach a better way to get that thing. We teach you a more functional way to communicate your wants and needs, therefore rendering the problem behavior more effortful and less effective. Your application of DRA develops alternative communication response as an antecedent to diminish problem behavior. So this is why your FCT is an antecedent manipulation, or excuse me, antecedent intervention. We're going to develop a better communicative response in order to decrease the problem behavior. We are going to talk about establishing operations, motivating operations, and abolishing operations. I don't know if somebody wants to just pull out what chapter that's in Cooper. I highly recommend reading up on EOs, MOs, and AOs before we talk about that. EOs are awesome. ERs are the bread and butter of what we do. It can be a little tricky. But FCT basically develops behaviors that are sensitive to EOs. So what I mean by that, they're directly related to the establishing operation in place. For those of you guys that went to ASU like I did, I talked about functional communication for almost the whole 2 years, but it's a 2-step process. Complete the functional behavior assessment. So I identify the stimuli with known reinforcing properties that maintain the problem behavior. So I realized that Monique is engaging in screaming behavior because she wants the teacher, when the teacher's behavior is diverted, okay? I did my FBA, and then what do? I use those stimuli. In this case, the stimulus happens to be the teacher's attention because she stops class and reprimands Monique or ask Monique if she's okay or if she wants to come sit on her lap or whatever the teacher's doing. I have identified that stimulus is maintaining or reinforcing the screeching behavior. So now what do? I use the teacher's attention to reinforce. I use the teacher's attention to reinforce the alternative behavior. What's our alternative behavior? we are going to teach Monique a better way to access attention, either using vocalization, signs, communication board, picture cards, vocal output, gesture. The mode of communication does not matter. What matters is that the behavior, the alternative response matches the function. AACs, augmentative and alternative methods, are a set of procedures and processes to either supplement limited oral skills with non-oral methods or provide non-oral methods as a primary means. So people often think about AACs just as like iPads or different kinds of alternative communication like Dynavox and stuff like that. Your AACs are just any sort of procedures or processes to supplement or replace vocal communication, or in this case, oral methods. So we have unaided and aided systems. Unaided is systems that don't rely on instruments or other externals. So you're not aided, you use what you have. Your facial expressions, your gestures, your signs, your points, those are all unaided AAC systems. PACS is going to be an example of an aided system. This is a system that uses various external aids such as books, pictures, or computerized devices. So that would be your AAC. How do you select your AAC? Evaluate their performance. Then you select your AAC. You decide, is it a good idea to use aided systems, or should we use an unaided system? Unaided can be beneficial because the person they always have their hands, they always have gestures, they don't need to carry an extra thing, but it's somewhat limiting, right? Or you may choose to use an aided system such as a low or to high technology item. PECS is pretty low technology. Proloquo to go is pretty high technology. You also want to figure out what are the symbols, how are they going to access them. The most important thing is going to be your speaker and your audience. AACs, FCT, all boil down to verbal behavior, where you have a speaker and a listener. You have the individual and you have their audience. So you need to consider who is going to be the communicating and who's going to be communicating. Who's the speaker and who's the listener? Let's put it that way. I have seen some questions that have to do with choosing a mode of communication, and it's almost an ethical thing where they talk about the parents know that he does well with the iPad, but they don't have the finances or they don't want to learn it. They are happy with him pointing or something like that, right? What do you choose, aided or unaided? AACs are just any alternative method of communication. Anything outside of vocal, verbal, or oral language is considered an AAC. In kind of colloquial language, we talk about AACs as being like iPads or Dynavox or that lamp system that's like 500 pounds, as those being AACs, but it has anything that is something that is put in to supplement limited skills or as a primary means of communication. It's basically anything outside of talking, let's put it that way. PECS is an aided AAC. Books, pictures, computerized device. So the question was, if the parents, in a parent-teacher meeting, the parent says, I know he does well with the iPad, but maybe we can't afford it, or maybe I'm not technologically savvy and I can't figure out how to use Proloquo to go. You as a teacher, you're like, well, we know how to use Proloquo. We have 5 iPads. Is it ethically erroneous for you to have the child communicate in one environment using one skill, but their wider audience doesn't use it? That's a consideration. It's great that he can communicate with you as the teacher and the teacher aide, but 95% of his audience doesn't use that mode of communication. Which is a better system, a better AAC to use? Right, they can't generalize across. You also have different contrast effects, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because I can communicate at school, and at home I can't. Who's going to have more problem behavior? Maybe at home, because they can't communicate, but kicking works great at home, right? this school should provide parent training, but what if the child doesn't have an iPad they can take home with them? Or I have had parents who, it doesn't matter what you tell them, they do not want you to teach their child sign language. They have limited vocal verbal language. They have barely, four words, four sounds that they can make, right? It's just a consideration you have to make. And there's a lot of people, there's a lot of considerations between whether to use PACS or manual sign language. If anybody's interested, Dr. Carbone talks a lot about the use of topography-based versus selection-based modes of communication. So this is going to be just some considerations that you should make. So Melissa, you're also looking at students that are in schools. I have had a lot of students in South Carolina and Texas that are homeschooled. Then I've had a lot of parents whose iPad will be sent home, but they will never charge it, or the student will never have it. So you supply them with an item, but they don't use it. And you've tried training. What I was getting at is the mode of communication that you choose needs to meet what the total environment is going to use. Relevant to behavior rule. Is the mode of communication that you are teaching them going to help them to communicate post-intervention? When the teacher is not there, is that individual going to be able to access the reinforcers that they need? So yeah, just some considerations. Always look at the individual's choice. Always look at the audience. Who's listening? Who's the speaker? Who's the audience? What's feasible? What's doable? What's going to meet natural reinforcement? Behavioral contrast. How many of you guys get behavioral contrast and matching law mixed up? I do all the time. I always kind of like have to flip back and forth. So I'm going to show you a little bit about kind of how I have trained myself to remember this. This might be a brain dump thing for you as well. For your whiteboard. So your behavioral contrast has to do with a change in one component of a multiple schedule that increases or decreases the rate of responding on that component, accompanied by a change in the response rate and the opposite schedule. We'll talk more about compound schedules of reinforcement. But basically what we're looking at is one behavior and multiple schedules of reinforcement. So what I have sort of trained myself when I think about this is I picture this. I picture the little scales of justice with a B on it. It's one behavior. Only one behavior. We're talking about Melissa and Melissa's calling out in class, okay? One behavior, same behavior, but we have different schedules of reinforcement. Her behavior is either going to be higher in one environment because it's reinforced. That schedule of reinforcement is different in math class and art class, right? Math class, she gets attention for it. It's higher there. Art class, her teacher totally ignores her and she doesn't get that attention, that maintaining reinforcer, different schedules of reinforcement. 1B, different M's, different schedules. So behavior contrast can occur as a function of a change in reinforcement or a punishment, of course, density in one component of a multiple schedule. So with that in mind, what do you think is the best answer here? Behavior contrast is exemplified by A, well, a punishment program for a child with autism to suppress climbing. On a bookcase as an effect, there is an increase in climbing on playground equipment. B, while an overcorrection procedure is used to suppress a child's hand-mouthing at school, hand-mouthing increases at home. D, self-injury increases at school when a child's parents implement a punishment procedure or self-injury at home. Cool. So your schedule of reinforcement in this case is going to be our different environments. So in the classroom, climbing in on the bookcase is punished. Therefore, this little scale on the left is going to decrease. And therefore, they climb in the playground, that increases. So if you look at it as scales, they actually kind of have some sort of a covariation in one environment, one conditions, one schedule of reinforcement. The behavior is higher versus the other one because of its relative schedule, right? Parents parents implement a schedule of reinforcement where they punish self-injury, and at home, because of that contrast, the behavior increases in that environment. So matching law, I actually picture this little picture in my head. I picture this equation, and I just think to myself, 2 B's, there's more behavior, right? So with your matching law, thank you, Andy, I was just gonna say that, the behavior goes where the, well, actually, that is going to be more so your contrast effect, because the behavior goes where the reinforcement flows. So at school, so for this one, hand mouthing at school is down, so the behavior increases at home, because at home, the behavior is reinforced. So this would be an example of home, it increases, this is where the reinforcement is. In school, that's where the absence of reinforcement is, or in this case, there's a punishment program, right? So that might be something, and I actually did draw this out when I took the exam, because I could never remember them. I just thought to myself, behavior contrast, and I have my little scales, and one's higher and one's lower, and the behavior goes, if this is reinforced, it's going to go, that's where it's going to be heavier. The behavior allocates itself towards where the reinforcement is, but it's only one behavior. That's the B part. When it comes to your matching law, we have 2 behaviors. So we have behavior 1 and behavior 2, and those are 2 different behaviors. And in this equation, your R1 and your R2 are the corresponding reinforcement schedules for those behaviors. So I actually just thought to myself, if I have a question that has to do with kicking and hitting, you're looking at matching law. You're matching kicking and hitting, or you're comparing matching and hitting. And the matching law has to do with which of those 2 behaviors accesses more reinforcement. And this is the equation to which you'd figure that out. I don't believe you would ever have to actually do the math here. Matching law requires concurrent schedules of reinforcement for 2 or more behaviors. Should be like this. And I just put this in earlier today. This is not on your slides. So matching law requires concurrent schedules of reinforcement. We have 2 or more schedules. Matching law, we got our B's. Behavior contrast has to do with one behavior, and it's contrasted based upon the relative schedules of reinforcement. So when we talk about environments, it doesn't have to be a math and art class. It can also be mom and dad, right? Who knows about good cop, bad cop? That is behavior contrast. Dad lets me get away with things. Guess who I'm going to ask first? Dad. Dad is this part of the scales of justice, right? That's where that behavior is going to go. Both have to do, though, with the behavior changing. For this case, we're looking at the 2 different behaviors based upon changes in the schedules of reinforcement also. So if I am to put in, I have 2 different behaviors, and I change some sort of schedule, the 2 behaviors are going to shift. If I no longer reinforce your hitting behavior, and I do reinforce some other behavior, or I reinforce one behavior more than the other, you're going to see that one behavior increase. Same thing with behavior contrast. We have one behavior, but different schedules of reinforcement. If you have a schedule change in one, you're going to see it increase in the other. So hopefully this helps as far as the 2. Just remember, matching law has to do with different behaviors. Behavioral contrast has to do with the one behavior and changes in environments or schedules of reinforcement. Okay, Premack principle. Premack principle, AKA what? Awesome, Grandma's law. So the Premack states that the opportunity to engage in a high probability behavior or something that you are more likely to do. It doesn't have to be something preferred as much as it has to do with something high probability. Okay, something preferred contingent upon the occurrence of low probability behavior. So it doesn't necessarily mean unpreferred, but it means something you're less likely to do. Will function as a reinforcer for the low probability behavior. So it's typically stated as first this and then this. Be careful that we're not doing first go pee-pee on the potty and then we get Skittle. Pee-pee on the potty and a Skittle is just stating a rule. It's not technically pre-Mac. Pre-Mac is more like first do math homework, then you could do your reading homework. If reading is a higher probability and math is a lower probability. So technically we kind of use this wrong sometimes when we say first eat your broccoli, then you can have ice cream. Example, Donald's a child who prefers playing outside to reading. So in order to get him to read, mom says first read for 15 minutes, then you can play outside for 20 minutes. This is your actual high probability pre-Mac principle. The key is with pre-Mac, it's not the Skittles. The Skittles are not reinforcing pee-pee on the potty. That's a rule where I'm telling you, if you do this, you'll get this. With pre-Mac, the key is that the key is that accessing, completing the low probability behavior, you will then, so basically, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. So basically the idea is that by completing the low probability behavior, you will then complete the high probability behavior. So the high P is contingent upon the occurrence of the low P. If it's not first broccoli, then it's ice cream. That is stating a contingency of reinforcement. I'm telling you, hey, if you want to go to McDonald's on Friday, you have to do your homework all week. That's me stating a rule, stating a contingency for you. Pre-Mac principle has to actually do with actual behaviors. The opportunity to engage in a high probability behavior is contingent on the low probability behavior. It's a little bit more, you can think of it as preference as far as what do you like to do more or less, but also a little bit more just having to do with a high probability behavior. You are more likely to do your math. If I were to give you a choice of math and reading, which would you choose? Let's say you don't like either of them very much, but your reading is more of a high probability behavior. I would use that high probability behavior contingent upon the occurrence of the low probability behavior. Response deprivation hypothesis is just simply an extension of the pre-Mac's relative value theory that we just talked about. But what's cool about response deprivation hypothesis is that they take into account baseline rates. So you have to take the baseline rates. Then you apply pre-Mac, okay? So you're predicting whether access to one behavior, which is the contingent behavior, will function as reinforcement for the other behavior. So in this case, the instrumental response is the math. I don't like math. I like reading. Reading's okay. I'm more likely to do reading. So reading is going to be my high probability behavior. Reading is the contingent behavior. Okay, so based upon the relative baseline rates. So you have to take baseline rates in which response deprivation hypothesis is all based upon. So access to the contingent behavior represents a restriction compared to the baseline level of agreement. Restricting access to behavior creates deprivation that serves as your establishing operation, making the restricted behavior a strong form of reinforcement. So here's our example. Jennifer loves riding her scooter, but she's not likely to complete her homework without challenging behavior. So in this example, we tell Jennifer that if she completes one page in her homework assignment, which is the instrumental response, she can ride her scooter for 5 minutes. So this looks a lot like pre-Mac, right? First do this activity and then you can do that activity. given that she's only allowed to access the scooter under conditions that she has completed her homework criteria. So we have to look at baseline rates. I need to look at how often does Jennifer ride her scooter. Jennifer rides her scooter every day for 30 minutes, okay? I need to make sure that I restrict scooter more than baseline. I need to restrict her scooter to less than 30 minutes every day. I need to create a state of deprivation. My state of deprivation is what makes the instrumental response, which is the homework, reinforced by the contingent behavior. So relative response deprivation is basically Premack principle. One behavior reinforces the other. One behavior contingent upon the other behavior, but you have to look at your relative baseline rates. How does this work? Have you guys ever tried to reinforce, to provide someone with something, but then it turns out they actually access that thing more than they used to? Like, I was trying to provide praise for you because typically the student didn't get a lot of praise, and then it turned out mom actually was noticing that, and therefore the value of praise went down a little bit. Something like that, that would be an example. So you need to look, deprivation has to do with the baseline levels in which they were getting that, and you need to make sure that you have created a state of deprivation in order for it to work. So you do what you like first, then you like less. No, it would be the opposite. So if I like, there's math and there's reading, right? I would say, okay, let's say, I'm just gonna keep going with the thing that I don't like math. So I would say, okay, first do your math homework and then you could do reading. Reading is more of a high probability, right? Premack principle, you have to do the low probability thing. The high probability thing is contingent upon completion of the low probability thing. Right? So technically we can do it a lot with things that are preferred, but it doesn't have to be, is the point. When we talk about first PP and the potty, then the skittle, that is just stating a rule, that is stating a consequence. Premack principle has to do with one behavior. High probability behavior is contingent upon the occurrence of the low probability behavior. You have to do one thing in order, you do the low P, then you can do the high P. Jenna, eating ice cream is a good reinforcer that you're presenting, right? I'm stating to myself, if I do this, I can do this. But is eating ice cream a behavior, or is that just a reinforcer that you're presenting? When you're looking at Premack principle, you're looking at the opportunity to engage in a behavior. So it's not necessarily just stating a rule. The high probability behavior needs to be contingent upon the low probability behavior. Premack is simply arranging two different behaviors, and the high probability behavior is contingent upon completing the low probability behavior. Right? So it can be, just be careful that you're not always looking at just as telling you what you can earn. If I say clean up your mess and then you can get a cookie, I'm telling you what you can earn, right? I'm telling you what you can earn. I'm stating a rule and a contingency. Premack principle in its own has to do with the high probability behavior is contingent only upon the occurrence of the low probability behavior. So we can be looking at different stimuli, just it's not as simple as PP on the potty, then you can get a skittle. The arrangement of the low occurrence of the high probability contingent on the occurrence of the low probability is the key. Premack is the same thing, except the high probability behavior, you need to restrict that. Deprivation is always restricting. Yes, response deprivation hypothesis has to do with restricting. You need to make sure if it's effective, you need to restrict it. I need to make sure that, in this case, Jennifer riding the scooter is the behavior. That's the instrumental response. Or that's the contingent behavior. The instrumental response is her homework. right? But if I need to make sure that I restrict her scooter lower than baseline in order to create to increase the probability of that contingent behavior. It's just basically, I mean, we're really just looking at manipulating establishing operations in a lot of ways, but Premack and RDH, it's the flow. What I'm trying to get at is it's not the skittle. It's not the skittle the skittle is the reinforcer. The high probability behavior contingent upon the occurrence of the low probability behavior is the key to both Premack and RDH. The stimulus or the behavior, whether it's eating the ice cream, is the behavior we're looking at, but we're not looking at the ice cream, which is the stimulus that's presented. That's just restating a rule. That's stating a reinforcing contingency. Awesome. Yeah, if you see anything that has to do with RDH, just make sure that you're looking, it's going to have something that has to do with baseline and restricting it below baseline in order to make that contingent behavior more reinforcing after completion of the instrumental response. And we are at number 58. We're going to finish where we were for number 59, and we'll talk a little bit more about contingencies of reinforcement and all that fun stuff. We will continue talking about, we're going to get into stimulus equivalence and derived relations and all kinds of fun stuff next week. So if you have any questions from now until then, just let me know.